night the reactor screamed. January 3, 1961. 9:01 p.m. A phone rings at the fire station of the National Reactor Testing Station, a stretch of frozen desert in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. An automatic alarm has just gone off at a small experimental nuclear reactor called SL-1. It's nothing unusual. Alarms go off out here all the time: false positives, faulty wiring, a technician bumping a sensor. The men on duty don't rush. They drive out into the dark, across a landscape of sagebrush and snow, expecting another non-event. They will find 3 men inside that reactor building. One of them will be pinned to the ceiling. This is the story of the only nuclear reactor accident in United States history to kill anyone on the spot, and of the 4-millisecond mistake that turned a routine maintenance shift into one of the strangest, most gruesome disasters of the atomic age. Part 1: The Promise of the Atom. To understand why 3 young men died inside a steel silo in the Idaho desert, you have to understand what the U.S. military wanted the atom to do for it. It's the late 1950s. The Cold War is at a rolling boil. The Soviets have Sputnik. America has just watched its rival put a satellite in orbit and is scrambling to prove it hasn't fallen behind, not in space, and not anywhere else. Deep in the Arctic, the U.S. is building a chain of early warning radar stations along the DEW line, the distant early warning line, designed to detect Soviet bombers coming over the pole. These stations sit in some of the most remote, punishing terrain on Earth. And they need power. Constant, reliable power, to run radar dishes through blizzards and 6-month nights. The problem is fuel. Diesel generators need diesel. And hauling diesel to the Arctic Circle is absurdly expensive. Every gallon has to be flown or dragged in by tractor train across frozen wilderness. The Army starts asking a tantalizing question: what if, instead of trucking in fuel every few weeks, you could drop in a small nuclear reactor that ran for years on a single fuel load? That idea becomes the Army Nuclear Power Program. And its first working prototype is a small reactor built by Argonne National Laboratory, originally called the Argonne Low Power Reactor, ALPR, later renamed something blunter and more military: Stationary Low Power Reactor No. 1. SL-1, for short. SL-1 isn't meant to power a city. It's a proof of concept, a boiling water reactor designed to be small enough to prefabricate, ship in pieces, and assemble on site by a small crew with modest training. Simplicity is the whole point. This is a reactor meant to be operated not by PhD physicists, but by soldiers. It's built at the National Reactor Testing Station, a vast fenced-off expanse of desert about 40 miles west of Idaho Falls, a place where the government tests all kinds of experimental reactors, far from any town, in case something goes wrong. SL-1 starts producing power in August 1958. It sits inside a cylindrical steel building, not a hardened concrete containment dome like you'd picture at a modern nuclear plant, but a relatively thin steel silo, because this reactor is small, low power, and considered low risk. For over 2 years, it works. Soldiers rotate through, training on it, running it up and down, learning to be reactor operators for a fleet of similar units the Army hopes to eventually scatter across the Arctic. It is unglamorous, workmanlike, slightly tedious work. Log the readings. Watch the gauges. Wait for your relief. Nobody, at this point, expects SL-1 to make history. Part 2: The Men of the Night Shift. By the end of 1960, SL-1 has been shut down for the holidays, routine maintenance, a chance to service equipment before restarting operations in the new year. The plan is simple: bring the reactor back online on January 4th. The task of prepping it for restart falls to a 3-man night crew. Let's meet them, because their names deserve to be more than a footnote. Army Specialist John Burns, 22 years old. Army Specialist Richard McKinley, 27, a young technician still building his career in this strange new field. And Richard Legg, 26, a Navy Seabee attached to the crew, trained in construction and now cross-training on reactor operations. None of them are grizzled veterans of the nuclear industry. That's not a knock on them, it's the entire design philosophy of the Army program. This is supposed to be an any competent enlisted man kind of technology, easy enough to hand off to soldiers rotating through a training assignment. They arrive for their shift around 4 p.m. on January 3rd. Outside, it's a brutal Idaho winter night, well below freezing, wind cutting across open desert. Inside the reactor building, their job is mechanical, almost mundane. Reconnect the control rods to their drive mechanisms after the maintenance shutdown, so the reactor can be restarted the next day. Nuclear reactors are controlled, fundamentally, by rods made of neutron-absorbing material. Slide them into the core, and they soak up the neutrons that sustain the chain reaction, slowing or stopping it. Pull them out, and you let the reaction speed up. SL-1 has 5 of these control rods. The most important is the central one, the one with the most control authority, the one capable of adding the most reactivity if withdrawn. Procedure calls for the crew to lift this central rod just a few inches, roughly 4 inches, to reconnect it to its drive mechanism. A small, careful movement. Nothing dramatic. At some point that night, that is not what happens. Part 3, the 4 milliseconds. Here is what investigators would eventually piece together, largely through forensic reconstruction, because there were no surviving witnesses and no working instruments left intact enough to tell the full story on their own. Sometime around 9:01 p.m., one of the 3 men manually pulled the central control rod, not 4 inches, but roughly 20 inches. Far, far beyond the maintenance procedure. Investigators never determined with certainty why. Was it a misread instruction? A stuck rod that someone yanked hard to free, only to have it come loose all at once? A moment of confusion in a cramped, awkward workspace, pulling on the rod with more force than intended? To this day, nobody knows for certain what was in that man's head in the seconds before it happened. The man who did it did not live to explain himself. What we do know is the physics of what came next, and it is almost unbelievably violent for such a small piece of equipment. Pulling the central rod that far didn't just nudge the reactor toward criticality. It shattered every safety margin at once. The reactor went prompt critical, a term that describes a runaway chain reaction sustained not by the normal, comparatively slow feedback loops reactors are designed around, but by the reaction feeding directly and instantly on itself. In ordinary operation, a reactor's power rises and falls over seconds, controlled with careful, incremental rod movements. What happened at SL-1 unfolded over 4 milliseconds, faster than you can blink, faster than a nerve impulse can travel from your hand to your brain. In that instant, the reactor's power spiked catastrophically. Investigators later calculated a surge to roughly 20 gigawatts, an almost unimaginable figure for a reactor rated at just 3 megawatts of thermal power in normal operation. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The fuel plates in the core didn't just overheat, some of them melted and vaporized almost instantly, flashing the surrounding water into steam with explosive force. And that steam had nowhere gentle to go. It slammed upward against the 7 feet of water sitting above the core, accelerating that entire column of water like a piston. Investigators estimated it moving at something like 160 feet per second into the reactor vessel's heavy steel head. The pressure of that water hammer has been estimated at somewhere around 10,000 pounds per square inch. The reactor vessel, along with its shield plug and the control rod assemblies still attached to it, was blown upward with tremendous force, slamming into the ceiling of the reactor building before crashing back down. It was, in every meaningful sense, a bomb going off inside a room 3 men were standing in. Part 4, what the fire crews found. Back at the fire station, the alarm that came in at 9:01 p.m. looked, at first glance, like nothing special. Heat detection alarms tripped sometimes. But this one didn't clear, and when the first responders, a mixed team from the Atomic Energy Commission's fire and security details, arrived at the SL-1 building, they immediately understood this was not routine. Radiation levels at the site were measured at around 25 rentgens per hour, high enough that the first team had to pull back rather than push further in blind. This was, after all, an era before responders had detailed plans for exactly this kind of scenario at exactly this kind of reactor. They had to feel their way forward, cautiously, in the dark, in the cold, not knowing what they'd find or how dangerous the environment inside actually was. When rescuers finally did get inside, they found a scene that would haunt the nuclear industry for decades. 2 of the men were found dead at the scene, one of them so severely injured by the force of the explosion that his death would have been effectively instantaneous. The third man was found alive, technically, and was rushed out for medical attention, but died shortly afterward. His injuries were simply not survivable. Perhaps the most infamous, most retold detail of the entire disaster involves the reactor vessel's plug and shielding assembly, the heavy steel components blasted upward by the force of the explosion. One of the men had been standing almost directly above the core when the rod was pulled. He was struck and pinned to the ceiling of the reactor room by the ejected shield plug, impaled by one of the control rod mechanisms that had been driven upward with it. It took rescue crews time, and no small amount of courage given the radiation readings, to bring his body down. This detail has circulated for over 60 years, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened, but at its core it's true, and it's part of why SL-1 has never quite faded from nuclear folklore the way some more famous accidents have. It wasn't a slow-motion meltdown playing out over days, like 3 Mile Island, or a fire spewing radioactive smoke for over a week, like Chernobyl. It was a single, violent, 4-millisecond event that killed 3 men almost instantly and left a scene so radioactive and so gruesome that recovery operations had to be conducted with extraordinary caution. Part 5, The Recovery. What followed was one of the strangest and most technically demanding cleanup operations in the early history of nuclear power. The building itself remained intensely radioactive for weeks. Workers could only enter for minutes at a time before their dose limits were reached, meaning recovery had to be broken into a rotating relay of personnel, each one doing a small piece of the job before being replaced by the next. Bodies had to be recovered, decontaminated as much as possible, and eventually buried, and this is where one of the accident's most striking long-term legacies comes in. The victims' remains were so contaminated with radioactive material that ordinary burial wasn't considered adequate. Portions of their remains were interred in lead-lined caskets, sealed inside concrete vaults, to prevent the slow leaching of radioactive material into the surrounding ground over decades. One of the 3 men, Richard McKinley, was buried with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, in a lead-lined casket, inside a concrete vault, a detail so unusual that his grave remains, to this day, one of the very few markers at Arlington accompanied by radiological precautions. Even now, more than 60 years later, Arlington's records flag his grave for radiation safety protocols before any excavation nearby. Investigators, meanwhile, faced a genuinely difficult forensic puzzle, reconstructing, in painstaking detail, the sequence of a disaster that had unfolded in a handful of milliseconds and killed everyone who could have explained it firsthand. They pieced it together from wreckage, from the physical position of the components, from careful analysis of the fuel and the rod mechanisms, and from a meticulous physical reconstruction of the reactor core's condition after the explosion. Their conclusion was that the central control rod had been withdrawn approximately 20 inches, vastly beyond what any procedure called for, and that this single act had triggered the prompt critical excursion that destroyed the reactor. What they never definitively answered, what remains, to this day, a genuine historical mystery, is why. Was it an accident? A moment of dangerous improvisation to free a stuck rod? Something else entirely? Various theories have circulated for decades, some more speculative than others, including rumors about personal conflict among the crew members that were investigated at the time and never substantiated as a cause. The Atomic Energy Commission's official findings focused on the technical failure, the design flaw that allowed a single rod, pulled by human hands, to hold that much destructive potential, rather than assigning a definitive motive to the man who pulled it. Part 6. Why it happened, the design flaw beneath the human error. It would be easy to end the story there, a tragic human mistake, 3 young men dead, case closed. But that misses the more important, more useful part of the story, the part where a horrifying accident actually made the world safer, because of what came after it. The uncomfortable truth investigators uncovered was that SL-1's design allowed a single point of human error to produce a catastrophic result. The central control rod carried an outsized share of the reactor's total reactivity control, meaning that if it were withdrawn too far, on its own, without any other rod moving at all, it was physically capable of pushing the reactor into a prompt critical state. In a better designed reactor, no single rod, pulled by one person's hands on one bad night, should be able to do that much damage on its own. This is sometimes described using a term that became central to nuclear safety philosophy in the decades that followed: single-point vulnerability. A well-designed safety-critical system should not allow one mistake, by one person, in one moment, to cascade into catastrophe. There should be redundancy. There should be interlocks. There should be a design that assumes, correctly, that tired people on a cold night shift will sometimes make mistakes, and that the machine itself needs to be forgiving enough to survive those mistakes. SL-1 wasn't built with that philosophy baked in deeply enough. It was built to be simple and easy to operate by soldiers with limited specialized training, and there is a version of simple that quietly trades away safety margin for convenience, without anyone fully reckoning with the trade-off until it's too late. The other uncomfortable finding involved the informality of procedures and culture at facilities like SL-1 in this early, almost improvisational era of nuclear power. Reactor operations that would later be governed by exhaustive, redundant, triple-check procedures were, in 1961, still being worked out largely through experience and institutional trust. Standards existed, but the broader culture of nuclear safety, the deeply ingrained caution that eventually became standard across the entire industry, was still being built, in no small part, because of accidents like this one. Part 7. The Legacy. SL-1 remains, to this day, the only nuclear reactor accident in United States history to have caused immediate deaths. It's classified as a Level 4 event on the International Nuclear Event Scale, an accident with local consequences, a modest-sounding label for an explosion that killed 3 people and left a permanent scar on nuclear safety culture. Because the site was remote, chosen specifically for that reason, the radioactive material released into the environment, while measurable, never posed a threat to any nearby town. No surrounding population was exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. In that narrow sense, the isolation the Army had built into the whole DEW line power concept, put the reactor somewhere nobody lives, ended up limiting the damage to the men actually working inside the building that night. But the human cost, of course, wasn't measured in curies released to the atmosphere. It was 3 young men, a specialist barely out of his teens, a Navy Seabee learning a new trade, a technician building a career in a field the whole country was still inventing, who went to work on an ordinary winter night to do routine maintenance, and never came home. In the years that followed, the accident fundamentally reshaped how the nuclear industry thought about reactor design. Regulators and engineers moved decisively away from designs where a single control rod could carry that much unilateral reactivity control. New reactors were engineered with redundant safety systems specifically so that no single human action, however careless or however deliberate, could trigger this kind of runaway excursion on its own. Procedures for handling and reconnecting control rod mechanisms were tightened industry-wide. The entire culture of nuclear operations shifted toward the layered, redundant, almost obsessively cautious safety philosophy that defines the industry today. The philosophy embodied in the now famous engineering principle of defense in depth, where a facility is never allowed to rely on just one safeguard, because any single safeguard can fail. The Army's own nuclear power ambitions never really recovered. The dream of scattering small, soldier-operated reactors across the Arctic to power radar stations quietly faded in the years after SL-1. The military's nuclear power program wound down over the following decade, its ambitions increasingly overshadowed by both the technical lessons of the accident and the simple fact that other logistics solutions proved less politically and technically fraught. Part 8. Why SL-1 Still Matters. It would be tempting, 6 decades on, to file SL-1 away as a strange, grim footnote from the earliest, most reckless days of the atomic age, something that couldn't happen now. In an era of vastly more sophisticated reactor design, redundant safety systems, and rigorous international oversight. And in the narrowest technical sense, that's true. No modern commercial reactor allows a single control rod, pulled too far by one person's hands, to trigger a prompt critical excursion like the one that destroyed SL-1. But the deeper lesson of the accident is less about nuclear engineering specifically and more about the nature of catastrophic risk in any high-consequence system. SL-1 is a case study in what happens when a technology is designed around the assumption of correct human behavior, rather than around the certainty that humans, eventually, on some ordinary Tuesday or some frigid January night, will make a mistake. The reactor didn't fail because its operators were reckless cowboys. It failed because its design left almost no margin for the kind of small, human error that happens in workplaces every single day: a rod pulled a little too far, a procedure misread, a moment of confusion in a cold, cramped room at the end of a long shift. That is the principle that echoes far beyond nuclear engineering, into aviation, into medicine, into any field where a single person's momentary lapse can trigger consequences vastly out of proportion to the mistake itself. Good systems assume error. Good systems build in the redundancy to survive it. 3 men went to work on a January night in 1961 to do a job they'd likely done, or watched done, dozens of times before. They didn't know that the machine in front of them had a hidden vulnerability, a flaw invisible in the blueprints, invisible in the procedures, invisible right up until the moment someone's hands moved a few inches too far. Their deaths rewired how an entire industry thought about safety. Every modern reactor operating today, every layered, redundant, deliberately over-engineered safety system standing between a chain reaction and a room full of people, carries, in some small way, the legacy of that night in the Idaho desert. It's a legacy none of them chose. But it's one worth remembering.